When you first meet people, all you notice are the differences between you and them. But as time passes, you start noticing the similarities.
They're ambitious in the sense that they want to make a mark. They want to be a killer of some renown.
These eyes do not see what you and I see. Behind these eyes, one finds only blackness, the absence of light. These are the eyes of a psychopath.
The psychopath and the sociopath. They're both people who show little regard for norms and laws that govern societal interactions, and they show very little remorse for what they do that harms other people.
Oh, Mr. Policeman. Don't you know a clown can get away with murder? Huh?
And he would say, show me the tape. Show me the tape of me confessing.
Doc, it sounds to me like you're talking about the Antichrist.
Well, perhaps I am.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. Before we dive into today's episode, I need to break from tradition and offer a different kind of introduction. Normally I'd begin with a forethought, an idea, or a concept of the strange, the mysterious, or the unsettling to set the stage for what's to come. But this time that feels entirely inappropriate. What we are about to discuss is not something I would normally approach with my typical framing. This isn't a tale of the unknown that leaves us in wonder. It's something far darker, far more unsettling. What we're going to examine today is a case that burrows deep into the darkest recesses of human nature. And it's the story of a man, someone who on the surface appeared to be just another face in the crowd, a respected member of his community. But beneath that mask of normalcy, there was something far more sinister lurking, something that even now, decades later, continues to haunt the minds of those who investigate it. This episode won't delve into the grisly details, but the weight of its subject matter is inescapable. We're talking about the kind of evil that thrives in secrecy, that hides behind a veil of trust and respectability. It's the kind of darkness that operates in plain sight, preying on the most vulnerable and leaving behind only questions. Questions that may never have answers. What we are going to explore will take us to places where morality becomes blurred, where empathy is replaced by manipulation, and where the truth is far more disturbing than any fiction we could create. I want to be clear. This is not a tale of horror meant to shock you with graphic violence. No, the true terror here lies in the realization that the most dangerous among us can often be the ones we least suspect. The killer we'll be investigating here didn't wear his crimes on his sleeve. He wore a mask. Maybe a literal one. And that mask, that false face of normality, allowed him to slip under the radar for years, operating with impunity in a world that thought it was safe. So I ask you to approach this episode with caution. What we're about to hear isn't simply a recounting of events. It's a descent into the psyche of a man who blended in with society, even as he committed the unthinkable. This episode will leave you questioning everything you know about the nature of evil. And as we peel back layers, you might find yourself wondering, what else is hiding in the shadows, right under our noses, waiting to be uncovered? As always, listener discretion is advised, and the truth, as it often does, is stranger and far darker than anything we could have ever imagined. So brace yourself, because sometimes it's not just the story that's terrifying. It's the realization of how little we truly understand about the world around us. There is a darkness that lives in all of us. Though we spend our lives trying to ignore it, for some it stays buried, a shadow barely seen. For others it takes hold, dragging them into the depths of what we fear most, a life without boundaries, without remorse. It's easy to label those people as monsters, to dismiss them as entirely other. But is the divide between them and us as wide as we'd like to believe? And I've stared at that question more times than I care to count, faced with acts so unthinkable that they defy understanding. Yet understanding is precisely what we must seek, not to excuse but to expose, because without acknowledging that darkness, without accepting its presence, we can't hope to control it. Therefore, why not speak to one who has spent 5 decades in the mauve shadow, conversing with some of America's darkest criminals? He is the forensic chronicler, the pathologist of evil, a true crime cartographer, Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, BT. Good to be with you.
Now, we're going to be talking about your book today, and before we mention that, I thought it would be good to hear a little bit about you and some of the details of your life.
Well, I'm retired now from my 25-year practice as a forensic psychologist. One of the things, I thought I was going to be an English professor coming out of undergraduate school, and that's kind of what I did for the next 5 years. Got a master's in English at Purdue, went to Trinity College in Dublin to study modern Irish literature, and I thought I was on a path to getting my PhD in English and becoming an English professor. But along the way, I decided that academia really wouldn't be a comfortable niche for me. So for reasons that, looking back, seem pretty random, I described them in my book, I thought I would give hospital administration a try. A very sharp departure from anything I had ever done before, since I had never taken a business class in my life. But I got my master's at George Washington in healthcare administration and came to a hospital in Ohio to do my residency. And I stayed on there after my residency. And as it turned out, 2 women were murdered in one of my departments right off the hospital's main corridor on December 30th, 1983. And without going into any detail about that, it's the first chapter in my book because it changed the trajectory of my entire life. After that, I decided this hospital administration thing had been a noble experiment, but it wasn't a good long-term solution for my career-related angst. And I thought, well, I would really like to know more about the kind of people who could have killed Patty and Joyce. And there's a backstory to their murders that I tell in my book. I won't go into it now, but I wanted to understand the kind of people who might have committed those baffling unsolved murders of the 2 women right off the main corridor in the hospital where I worked. So I went back and did my PhD at Ohio State in psychology and embarked on a career mainly as a forensic psychologist.
Yes, and that book we're talking about it's That Beast Was Not Me. One Forensic Psychologist, 5 Decades of Conversations with Killers. It's available Amazon and everywhere else books are sold. It was in that book that among the names of these murderers, these killers that you had talked about, that one of them basically really haunts, I guess, the American crime history or the history of American crime. And the one that I was thinking about talking to you with is probably one of the most chilling, and that was John Wayne Gacy, who was known, I think, across news media at the time as the Killer Clown. And it was there, looking at this chapter of your book, that I resolved, and I thought, hey, talking to Dr. Smaldon would be great if we could just talk about Gacy's persona and how it really encapsulated this disturbing duality. Basically, a man who played this cheerful entertainer at like children's parties, and then he was just doing these horrible acts underneath. During our conversation back and forth via email, I had come to learn that you had really spent a long time talking with John Wayne Gacy. Can we interact and tell me about how that interaction started?
That particular interaction spanned 3 calendar years, from 1986 to 1989. But yeah, I had begun graduate school at Ohio State in the fall of 1985, and the crimes, the double homicide at the hospital where I had worked, Riverside Methodist Hospital here in Columbus, remained unsolved. And I had already written to Ted Bundy, hoping that if I could lure Bundy, or coax him is maybe a better, slightly less pejorative word, if I could coax him into a dialogue with me, maybe I would learn something about the mind of someone who would commit a double homicide like that. I knew Bundy was known for sometimes seeming to disappear into thin air after committing his crimes. And I never got that far with Bundy. He waited a year before answering my letter, and then answered it in late 1985 with a sort of cryptic, gamey letter that is very interesting in its own right. Maybe we'll get to that. But I had decided, okay, well, that was a very interesting response from Bundy, but it wasn't what I had hoped for. And I decided not to write him back. I thought, this seems like it's a probable dead end, given what my aims were. But I thought, well, so what other repeat killer might I be able to coax into a dialogue of the kind I hope to have with one of these kinds of killers? And I wrote to John Wayne Gacy. And Gacy would have known from my letter that I knew a fair amount about his case. I told him I had read 3 books about it, one of which had just come out months before I sent my first letter to him in early 1986. And he wrote back in kind of a testy, irascible sounding voice, I hate to tell you this, but you don't know a thing about me from reading those books. That's all fantasy and hypothesis and speculation. It's mostly unreal and untrue. You don't know a thing about me. And I thought, well, maybe he doesn't want to exchange letters. But then he ended on a congenial note, and he said, hey, write me back. Look forward to your letter. So I thought, well, okay, that's a little more optimistic sounding. So I wrote him back. And our correspondence ended up lasting for 3 years. I estimated in my book that he had probably written me about 50 letters, many of them 4 and 5 typewritten pages during that period. On average, we would exchange letters every 2 weeks or so. He would phone me on occasion, always collect, of course. And he invited me to come and visit him on death row in Illinois, about 450 miles from where I was then finishing. Well, by the time I visited him the first time, I was in the fall semester of my second year of graduate school. So I made 2 separate trips to see him on death row. And one of the things, I have a tendency to forget this myself sometimes, but I remind readers in my book because I think it's easy to sort of lose sight of where I was in terms of my long history of interactions with killers. By this time, I had already had extensive interactions with Charles Manson, Squeaky Fromme, Susan Atkins, Tex Watson, other members of the Manson family, but I had never before been in the same room with someone known to have committed murder, even one murder, let alone 33. So I was very green when I set off for southwestern Illinois to have my first meeting with Gacy in December of 1986. So that's how it came about. Gacy invited me to come, told me, don't sign in as a psychologist, whatever you do. Don't try to sign in as a journalist. Sign in as my friend. So I said, okay. And that's what I did.
Step into the mind of a killer, if you dare. In That Beast Was Not Me, renowned forensic psychologist Jeffrey L. Smaldon invites you to explore 5 decades of harrowing encounters with the most infamous murderers in history: Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, and more. Through letters, interviews, and face-to-face confrontations, Smaldon unveils the shocking truths behind their twisted minds. But this is more than a journey into darkness. It's a deeply personal memoir of how one man's quest for answers led him to confront evil itself. Sometimes the scariest monsters are human. For fans of true crime and anyone who dares to question what drives humanity's darkest impulses, this is your invitation. That Beast Was Not Me, available now. Grab your free chapter with the link below. The interesting thing with individuals that we see go, somewhere like death row, they go through long trials and psychologists talk to them to try to figure out what's going on. I do believe he spent even time talking to them in prison. And I'm curious as to specifically what has been called his ability to manipulate, specifically manipulate like the community and his family, that he hid these heinous acts that he was doing.
Well, he was extraordinarily good at that, at curating a public personality that convinced his victims to let down their guard, to not see him as threatening. That was all part of the game. And to not bring attention to himself by the authorities, not bring attention to himself from his neighbors. He was known as a good neighbor, first guy who would offer to plow the neighbors' driveways when it snowed, held a big party in his backyard. It was usually a themed party of some kind, like the American Revolution one year, and was just seen as kind of a jovial, good guy. And, for a lot of... unfortunately, most of these repeat killers don't look like Charles Manson. We would know to run if they did, but they don't. They look pretty much like everyone else. Bundy did, Gacy did, many of these killers are incredibly well camouflaged. And, Gacy, even when he was in prison, I'll always remember how he greeted me the first time we met in a small visiting room on death row. He entered the visiting room. He had leg manacles on and handcuffs on, and he had a big pile of like photo albums or journals that he was clutching to his chest, set them down on the table and extended his hand to shake my hand. And I just said, "Hi, John, Jeff, good to meet you." And he said, "Yeah, good to meet you too. I know, you're looking for the monster. Well, you're going to meet the man." And that's, who talks that way about themselves? I mean, the grandiosity was immediately on display. Now you're going to meet the man, like, he was some sort of celebrated figure. But he was very preoccupied with the fact that I would have come with the expectations that had been planted in my mind by the popular depictions of him as a monster, and he was out to demonstrate to me that he was anything but that.
Is it true to say that John had some antisocial tendencies and mannerisms?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that you and I discussed a little bit in email correspondence is the distinctions between antisocial personality disorder, which is the only disorder that comes anywhere near psychopathy and sociopathy in the diagnostic and statistical manual that mental health professionals use to make diagnoses. But I think people have probably spent more energy than the discussion is worth, frankly, trying to tease apart exactly what the distinctions are among those three terms. And I mean, basically, anyone who's a psychopath, which I believe Gacy was unquestionably, though I never evaluated him for purposes of forming a diagnosis, but I think it's pretty clear that he was a psychopath. And a psychopath is the granddaddy of those three diagnoses. It's the most seriously impaired, the person with no conscience, no remorse, no regard for other people except insofar as they can be instrumental in meeting the perpetrator's needs. But most psychopaths are also that would qualify for a diagnosis of antisocial personality. And, probably the only distinction among those, well, one other distinction that's worth observing is between the psychopath and the sociopath. Just because they're both people who show little regard for norms and laws that govern societal interactions, and they show very little remorse for what they do that harms other people. But sociopaths are sometimes described as having shallow feelings of remorse, where psychopaths have none. And sociopaths are typically depicted as the people who are more impulsive, more inclined to feel rage and then act on it, where the psychopath will sit on it for a while and think about it and plan a more measured response. So theirs isn't the hot rage exploding into violence. It's the very calculated, very purposeful acts aimed at harming other people. Sociopaths are more likely to respond in the moment. But that said, most psychopaths and most sociopaths would also qualify for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. And the psychopath of the three is the most damaged in terms of their personalities. So in response to your question, that's a little bit of a rambling response, but you asked if John Wayne Gacy demonstrated antisocial tendencies. Unquestionably, yes. But he also was a dyed-in-the-wool psychopath.
Yeah, if I understand and remember correctly, Gacy had a pretty troubling childhood, a real horrible relationship with his father. And I mean, that just enters all sorts of psychological analysis there. But I mean, even to the point where he even struggled with personal identity, and some issues with that may have led to these behaviors. You're right. No, everything that I have read with John Wayne Gacy showed that he was a planner, not a impulse action individual. But I just find it interesting that if we were to go with the simple adage that psychopaths are born and sociopaths are made, as simple as we could say that is, clearly some of these early childhood traumas may have led to the person that John was as an adult.
Yeah, I think most people who study these disorders and the kind of behavior that Gacy engaged in would agree that in all likelihood, psychopaths bring a more damaged genetic load into the world when they're born. There's probably, a more prominent genetic predisposition to antisocial behavior in psychopaths than there are in other people. But the way those tendencies or predispositions get expressed can have a lot to do with their experiences. And I think in the case of most people who end up being true psychopaths, they would probably follow that trajectory almost no matter what happened in their upbringing. But certainly their upbringing, as I said, can play a role in how those tendencies get expressed. In Gacy's case, he had an interesting combination of very judgmental, harsh, shame-inducing father who, and these are Gacy's words to me, when we were discussing his family, he said, and he repeated them in other contexts to other interviewers, but he said, I could never do anything right in my dad's eyes. It didn't matter how small the error was. John, you're stupid. You're stupid. And then when he reached puberty and, Gacy didn't behave like the heterosexual son his father had in mind, then it became, you're a faggot, you're a fruit picker. And his father was a drunk, too, who would go down in the basement and drink and emerge to terrorize the family, to hit Gacy's mother, with whom he was very close, and particularly with John and his younger sister, Karen. According to John, their older sister had dropped out of nursing school to get married. And after that happened, his father basically wouldn't cut either of the younger two kids any slack at all and was very punishing and critical. So everything got worse from that point on, after the older sister had dropped out of nursing school and gotten married. But John, whenever anyone has invited him to talk about his upbringing, that comes first, how disapproving and critical his father was. Then when he gets around to talking about his mother, she doted on him. To me, he said, and he came as close to getting genuinely emotional during my conversations with him when the subject turned to his mother's loyalty and support for him even after his conviction. Because I had asked him, I wanted him to talk about his mother, but I wanted to give him a way to do it that was a little more oblique than just a direct question of, tell me about your mom and your relationship with her. So I asked him, how did your mother deal with all the publicity surrounding your case and your trial and your conviction? And he said, well, my mom was the strong one of the family, and he got almost choked up talking about her. And I think the combination of, feeling rejected by his dad and feeling perhaps overvalued by his mother, who tried to compensate for his harsh father, we haven't talked about narcissism yet, but Gacy not only was a psychopath, but surely would qualify for a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder too. The two aren't exclusive at all. And oftentimes people who grow up to be narcissists follow one of two pathways, at least most frequently. One is, they're treated very harshly and basically made to believe they're worthless as kids. So they develop this kind of compensatory narcissism that serves for them as a shell over these underlying feelings of hurt and insecurity. But then on the other hand, some narcissists have been pampered and treated as though they're very special from an early age. And so they grow up with a sense that the rules that apply to other people don't apply to them, and they're somehow special, and they, tend to be preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power and influence. So, in Gacy's case, he had a weird combination of rejection and overvaluing that contributed to his personality dysfunction, for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you mentioned power, basically power plays, and that was part and parcel with the behavior and selection of, Gacy's victims. Is this need for power and control, not just like in the sexual realm, but also like psychologically. He needed to overpower people in their minds.
Yeah. He was very much preoccupied with power and control. And it's why in actually the prologue to my book, I talk about the unsettling thought that while this guy was sitting across the table from me and acting the role of congenial kind of blue-collar bullshitter, basically, he was fantasizing that whole time about having me under his complete control. I knew that. And I knew that when I couldn't get the attention of a guard to help me find the restroom, Gacy was loving that. I mean, loving that idea of I'm alone with him in a death row visiting room, and I'm out there yelling in the hallway, trying to get the attention of a guard. And I go back into the room to tell Gacy, I can't get any guard to come back here and open the door so I can use the restroom. And Gacy just looks at me with a bemused smile, like, yeah, how do you like that? And I knew what was going on in his mind. I knew enough about him to know that that would have been a delightful circumstance for him. So yeah, and he chose victims who he perceived as vulnerable, people who might not be missed, oftentimes runaways, people who he knew weren't embedded. And some of I was very happy about a year ago when a book came out called Boys Enter the House, specifically focusing on Gacy's victims and their families and what they went through. Because Gacy clearly saw them as throwaways. A lot of them he picked up, in the streets of Chicago, and or they had worked for him for a while. He learned enough about them to at least come to believe that maybe they wouldn't be missed. And he loved, one of the things I talk about quite a bit in my book, certainly with regard to Bundy, but also with regard to Gacy, is the game part of what nets them so much satisfaction. This is also true of Thomas Lee Dillon, the serial sniper here in Ohio, on whose case I worked in the early 90s. But they were very gamey, and they derived so much satisfaction from that. And of course, that's part of the control as well. And another subject maybe we'll get into more, but Gacy's persona during his years on death row he could deny involvement in these murders all day. I mean, he could talk until you're blue in the face and your eyes are glazed over about how he couldn't possibly have been responsible for the murders of all these young boys who were found in his crawl space, elsewhere on his property, and some in the Des Plaines River, emphasizing that other people had keys to the house, and why do they assume that he was responsible for these murders. He could talk all day about how he was miscast as this serial killer. But, I would say, but John, didn't you confess to all these killings? Not once, but multiple times? It was a question that I broached kind of gingerly because I knew by that time how very prickly and defensive he got in the face of challenge of any kind. And his way of deflecting that inquiry was to say, there you go again with the fantasies and the speculation and the hypotheses. That's what the prosecution's case was built on. But you're smarter than that, Jeff. Don't be seduced by all that. And I would back off for a little and then come back and say, but so why did you confess then? I don't understand. And he would say, show me the tape. Show me the tape of me confessing. And for reasons I don't fully understand, even after all these years of reflecting on the Gacy case and reading about it, there is no tape. There is no tape of him confessing to his attorneys the night before his arrest, or of his multiple confessions to law enforcement officers. And the absence of those tapes, I don't understand why no tape was made, but the absence of a tape is what allowed Gacy up until the time of his execution in 1994 to say, no, I might have said anything. I'd been taking so many drugs and barbiturates and drinking so much that night with my attorneys. Who knows what I said? Yeah, maybe I did say something about committing some murders, but I was so out of my mind. It didn't mean anything. He never really explained why he would have. In terms of the police, he said, well, all you've really got to go on are the handwritten notes of the Des Plaines police claiming that I said these things. But these were cops who desperately wanted to close cases, and they wrote down whatever they wanted to write. I didn't say that stuff. So my point being that up until the time of his death, he worked very hard at maintaining this persona of the wrongfully accused innocent man. He did end up saying he knew something about 5 of the murders. He didn't let me go too far down the path on any of those. I would ask him what happened to John Butkovich, for example, who worked for him for a while, and he said, he was a punk, or whatever. And I would say, well, didn't he end up in your crawl space? And he would say, I can't go into that. My attorneys tell me I shouldn't discuss that. So he had ways of kind of turning off those discussions. But frankly, it intrigued me. He carried out his persona toward the end of his life, very unlike how Bundy chose to carry his out. Bundy perceived maybe there would be some immediate gain for him in disclosing locations of bodies, closing the case for families, and so on. And I think when he was, just trying to buy himself some time at the end, saying, I can lead you to where these women are, hope that it would lengthen his life a little. But Gacy never did that. I mean, he maintained right until the end. He never changed his position, never decided to take the full credit, if you can use that word, for all these murders. I'm sure in Gacy's mind, that's what it would have amounted to, taking credit. He was proud of what he achieved. He had no remorse, but he went to his death without ever disclosing what he knew.
Which all feeds into his deceptive and manipulative behavior. in his life before arrest, he basically led this double life where he was a successful businessman. And he was beloved, like you said, by his community. He would do things for neighbors. I mean, his image was a stand-up paragon of the community. But this was all part of his manipulation, all part of his public desire, his desire to deceive the public around him. And like you had said, this was part of his planning and his. How do we go from this guy who was okay, he hadn't yet committed to committing that first murder? How does he select his first victim, and what was his methodology behind that?
Well, it's not quite true to say he had never done anything, because before he moved to the Chicago area, joined his mother in Waterloo, Iowa, where he had gone to manage a couple Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises that his then father-in-law had owned. Gacy became very involved out there, as a very young man in the community. He was thought to be one of the top local JCs. I think he was named JC of the year one year. And, he was an organizer. He was always an organizer. His industry and his ambition play an essential part in the Gacy story. Always striving, always trying to prove himself. But when he was out in Waterloo, he had sex with. He was found guilty of having sex with one boy, but he had more victims than just that. But he was sentenced to do time in prison after being found guilty of that. And the MO was the same. He would have these teenage boys over to his house. Let's fun and games. Let's play pool, drink some beer. He would show them pornographic films. And one thing would lead to another, and Gacy would commit sexual acts with these minors. But anyway, he got released from prison early because he was such a good inmate. I mean, he was a model inmate. Did everything right. He became the head of the JC's chapter in the prison where he was, and he took over the kitchen, and so they released him early, and he went to serve out his parole in Chicago with his mother. And after he had moved out of his mother's and gotten a place of his own, his first victim there, and the first boy he's known to have murdered, for years was just referred to as the Greyhound bus boy, because he picked him up at a Greyhound bus depot in downtown Chicago. And that was one of the 5 murders that Gacy told me he knew something about. And he was consistent in telling that story of the first killing. He claimed that he and the boy had consensual sex together and drank some beers, and that he let the boy stay overnight at his house. And when he woke up in a spare bedroom, and then when he woke up in the morning, he, through his bleary eyes, he saw the boy coming at him with a knife. And he thought the boy was going to attack him, so he sprang from his bed and attacked him instead and killed him. And I said, well, didn't he end up in the crawl space? Gacy said, I can't talk about that. But he admitted that he killed that first victim, but he claimed it was in self-defense, which no one believes it was. But I think, he had a taste even before that for predatory behavior, targeted at young boys. But I think he found after that first murder that he liked it. I mean, he liked it. He got away with it. And, there was a certain exhilaration that he felt that, I could commit acts like this again, acts which might more closely fit my fantasy of what it is like to completely overpower a boy. And then he kept doing it, and he kept getting away with it. And he felt more and more arrogant and emboldened. And, you know, he worked hard at that persona that you described before as the friendly neighbor. And he got away with it for about 6 or 7 years. He was arrested in December of 1978.
There's a group of murderers that are like this, and it's the sexual. There's a lot of sexual fantasies involved in their actions, and I'm curious specifically. What I'm curious about. I mean, that's reprehensible, of course, and I'm not going to deny that or minimize the involvement of aberrant sexual fantasies, but it's. You know, if we examine whether Gacy's actions were a product of psychopathy or narcissism, or a product of maybe some kind of mental illness, not to excuse the behaviors, that's not the point of this mental exercise, but it's, you know, was there a mental illness behind these behaviors of some kind? I'm not going to say that the DSM once upon a time was right in listing homosexuality as a mental disorder, but I will say that Gacy does show signs of some kind of mental disorder.
Well, I mean, I think Gacy probably had some kind of mood-related disorder. I don't, to the best of my knowledge, evidence wouldn't have supported a diagnosis of bipolar disorder or manic depression, though I don't know enough to rule that out. But, you know, he certainly was subject to mood swings, but he self-medicated with drugs, barbiturates, amphetamines, so it's kind of hard to, you know, locate the original symptoms underneath that drug use. Gacy tried for a while to claim that these killings were the result of the actions of someone he called Jack, kind of an alternative persona. And anyone interested in that, I would direct to Tim Cahill's book, Buried Dreams, which, interestingly, that book had come out just months before I sent my first letter to Gacy, but I had already read it. And in that book, Cahill describes multiple visits with Gacy, lengthy interviews, where Gacy actually sort of acted like this Jack character a couple of times and really tried to sell that. And it's interesting that, to me, Gacy insisted that that book was entirely fabricated. That I think he said, I spent 10 minutes with that author one time. He called the book a complete fabrication. And I don't know if that's because by that time he had decided that's not going to work. That whole Jack thing is not going to work. I don't have multiple personality disorder. No, I'm not going to convince anyone of that. Some people saw Gacy as, they struggled at his trial. There were multiple mental health witnesses, and all of whose input Gacy just laughed at and mocked, just said, he said to me, do you know that in my trial, they said I was a psychopath and a sociopath and an antisocial personality disorder? Can't these people get their terms and their concepts straight? And he would rail about how useless mental health input in a criminal trial is. But, there were some incredible things said at his trial. One of the most incredible, in my opinion, and I believe she actually testified to this. she didn't just say it subsequently in an interview, but she was one of the mental health experts, the psychiatrist Helen Morrison. And she famously or infamously, I guess, depending on your point of view, testified at his trial that Gacy was so compelled to commit these murders that basically he had no control over himself, that she said that he would have killed his last victim, Rob Peast, even if there had been a police officer in the room with him. He couldn't help himself. The presence of a police officer wouldn't have stopped him. I don't believe that for a second. Gacy was far too in control most of the time. So I never saw evidence that he was delusional in the sense that, he really had a deep-seated belief, that would not change regardless of the evidence presented to him. That he was deluded in the sense that he was operating under some sort of false belief system. I think the real diagnoses, the primary diagnoses for Gacy would always need to be psychopathy, personality disorders, and not, and I don't mean to minimize the importance of those. One of the things I said frequently throughout my career is a lot of times courts have sort of dismissed antisocial personality, haven't really wanted to hear much about psychopathy and sociopathy. And I would respond most frequently just in my own head, well, by definition, these people are unable to feel remorse. They don't have a conscience. They're unable to relate to other people as human beings. That's pretty serious impairment. I mean, if we believe in if we believe in the concept of psychopathy, someone who has that disorder is seriously impaired. You can call it a mental illness or call it something else, but they're very seriously impaired.
Yeah, we've spoken briefly a little bit about how it was that Gacy would deflect responsibility for his criminal actions, and that leads to the question of did he just exist in a state of fantasy? The fantasy versus reality in the mind of John Wayne Gacy was clearly suspect from the get-go, especially if he's, right from the start with the Greyhound kid, and from the word go, there seems to be a realm that he entered into that was pure fantasy based, whatever it may have been, and that seems to have been where he basically ended his life, execution, detached from reality.
Yeah, I think he spent, like most other serial killers, spent a lot of time immersed in this fantasy world. I know one of the chroniclers of the BTK case in Wichita, Dennis Rader, talked about, Rader's fantasy life was much more vivid and real to him than the things going on around him on a day-to-day basis at work or at home. And I think the same could be said for Gacy. Gacy was kind of always in the process of sizing up opportunity, locating potential victims, figuring out what he was going to do next. I mentioned Thomas Lee Dillon before, the serial sniper on whose case I worked, and Dillon had an extraordinarily rich and elaborated fantasy life. And I'm certain that during his killing years, 1989 to 1992, that's what he spent most of his time thinking about. He went to work every day, and he had a wife and a young son, but his primary preoccupation was fantasies of killing.
If we were to take what we've spoken about with Gacy, what kind of comparisons can we draw with the other individuals mentioned in your book?
Well, one is we've talked a little about narcissism, and all of these people are incredibly narcissistic, where satisfying their needs is always the primary goal. A point that I often make when I talk about serial killers is that it's a term some people are uncomfortable applying to people who at some point have decided on a career of killing, which these people do. But they're incredibly ambitious. I mean, they're ambitious in the sense that they want to make a mark. They want to be a killer of some renown. And, when Dylan, who I spent a lot of time talking with, turned out he was a walking encyclopedia on true crime literature, and he thought about these things a lot. And he repeatedly would say to me, "Has there ever been a case like mine before? Has anything like this in Ohio ever happened, where a killer takes victims he has no prior relationship with, interacts with not at all or just slightly at the time of their murders, shoots most of them at a distance, there's no sexual contact," where the idea, I think, as he saw it, was kind of extracting the killer from the scene completely, taking care not to leave spent shells behind, that he would basically be a cipher who the authorities could never catch unless he screwed up, made a mistake, and handed himself to them. But he was very preoccupied with the uniqueness of his case. And we would talk about other cases that we had both read about, and he would compare his. He talked about Leopold and Loeb in the 20s, the two young, privileged young men who set out to commit the perfect murder, but screwed up by leaving a pair of eyeglasses behind that eventually led the authorities to them. And Dylan saw a comparison, like they were almost as close to him as anyone could come, because killing to them, as he said, was a mental game. And he said, I can relate to that. And he saw it the same way. And then he would say, yeah, I screwed up too. And I delivered myself to the authorities by selling that damn Swedish Mauser at the gun show. He thought that his screw up is what had led the police to him. Otherwise, they never could have caught him. But that sense of just trying to carve out a unique niche for themselves, and they see themselves as special. That's something that connects all of these people. I think their ambition and their sense of narcissism. It's all about their needs.
Yeah, it's like Ted Bundy. I believe the big thing with him was he'd kind of move around, so he wasn't ever really in one place to kill, and that chapter of your book is known as the Rover, and I think that that explains, to be honest, the titles of each of the chapters of your book that detail each of these individuals and their infamy, I guess, captures who they are, really. Like we said, John Wayne Gacy was the killer clown, Ted Bundy's the rover, Dylan's the sniper. These titles of each chapter really help hone the reader into looking at your book in a way that they can go, I can read this chapter and be okay. And I know who I'm reading about. And I think that's something really awesome, Doc, that you don't spend a whole lot of time fluffing the names of the chapters up, right? They're real simple, 2 to 3 words, and here's who you're pretty much going to be reading about. Prepare yourself. And I think that made, honestly, reading through your book that much more helpful. I didn't read it cover to cover. I read it this bit, back and forth. And I really enjoyed it. And I think it was a good book. It's considered your memoir. And do you have any final thoughts about putting the book together? And then we'll talk about your special offer.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that was my point when it came down to labeling the chapters. And one of the things I really want prospective readers to know about this book, people who might be thinking of reading it, it's not your typical true crime chronicle that begins with the discovery of a body and the accumulation of evidence and the identification of a panel of possible perpetrators, and then the denouement, the trial, and so on. It's really my story. It's my memoir. It doesn't dwell on the crimes. It takes the reader with me as I have my encounters with these people, beginning when I was only 21 years old. And as I say in my book, trying to, in a very naive way, penetrate the thick fog surrounding the Manson case back in 1975. And then, continuing through my career as a forensic psychologist. But for example, in the long chapter related to Gacy, I really wanted readers to feel like they were sitting there with me and they could really get a feel for what it was like to be with Gacy and have that experience of interacting with him. So that was my goal, and that's the kind of book it is. I meant it as a memoir first, a true crime book second, a memoir that happens to deal with all of these infamous killers.
And then, as related to your book, and in the show notes below is a link to a free chapter.
Yeah, and the free chapter is actually the prologue, but it's a book that I think kind of sets the tone of the book, and it's a very vivid, very memorable experience that I had, which is of desperately needing a restroom while I'm sitting opposite John Wayne Gacy, not knowing where one was, and having to ask, the first sentence of that chapter is, in a perfect world, you'd know the location of the nearest restroom, and you could get there without a serial sex killer's help. And that's, you don't really want to have to ask John Wayne Gacy for help finding a restroom. But there I was. So I would urge people with an interest in my book to take advantage of that pre-chapter offer and get a sense of the book's tone and flavor. I think the prologue provides that.
And then I'm gonna read to you the review that I've posted for your book, and so listeners can find my review in the reviews of Dr. Smaldon's book here. My review states, "In That Beast Was Not Me, Jeffrey Smaldon ventures into a world where the line between humanity and monstrosity blur. A landscape that I've looked at in true crime books before, and what makes this story more compelling isn't just the infamous figures Smaldon confronts, Gacy, Manson, and Bundy, but the way he challenges our understanding of evil. Smaldon reminds us that the monsters don't always come in the form of shadows or monsters in the dark. Sometimes they wear the face of your neighbor, your coworker, a smiling clown at a birthday party. This book isn't just about true crime. It's a mirror held up to the darker aspects of human nature. And if you're brave enough to look, may make you question what really separates us from them." Thank you, Dr. Smalldon, for being on my show. I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you for that, BT. Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.